of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight in Washington, blowback. President Trump facing widespread criticism for his stunning social media post, politicizing the deaths of movie director Rob Reiner and his wife, a day after their murders.
I wasn't a fan of his at all. He was a deranged person as far as Trump is concerned. I was not a fan of Rob Reiner at all in any way, shape, or form. I thought he was very bad for our country.
Growing number of Republican lawmakers now speaking out, calling the president's words inappropriate and disrespectful. We'll discuss ahead. Plus, an alleged New Year's Eve bomb plot thwarted. The actions today when federal agents arrested suspected members of a group accused of preparing explosive devices for coordinated attacks in Southern California. We'll give you the details coming up. Also tonight, just a few days after the president said he should be able to make recommendations on rate decisions by the Fed, one of his top picks to replace Jay Powell is saying otherwise. The differing views on Fed independence between the president and his own potential nominee up ahead. And breaking after the bell, Ford Motors announcing a major shakeup to its electric vehicle business. What CEO Jim Farley revealed to Bloomberg just moments ago about the automaker's future. We're tracking the stock's after-hours movement with Romaine Bostick and Power Moves. We'll have much more this hour. But we begin the countdown here in Washington with just 5 legislative days to go. This is it this week on Capitol Hill. And for the latest, we turn to Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, who joins us live here in our Washington bureau. It's a bit confusing here, Wendy. The Obamacare subsidies that led to the government shutdown expire at the end of the month. We've seen a couple of bills get votes in the Senate and fail. We're still not completely clear on what votes will happen this week in the House. But either way, it looks like we're going over the cliff.
It absolutely looks like we're going over the cliff, or as you said earlier, looks like we went over the cliff. Because at this point, even if the House somehow miraculously comes up with a plan to extend these subsidies or fix Obamacare or install a new health care plan, there's no way this can get done before they go on their Christmas recess. And President Trump, would have to sign a bill, which he doesn't seem inclined to do. There is no bill to sign. And so, yes, by the time this gets done, or if it does get done, people's premiums will have already spiked. It's just not, they just chalk this one up and left, they're going to leave town without fixing it.
Well, Speaker Johnson said there would be a Republican plan. He put that forth late on Friday. It does not extend Obamacare subsidies. There is, however, a discharge petition, which a lot of Americans are growing used to hearing about. It's the one way to get something on the floor that would extend the subsidies. If moderates don't like the Republican plan, do they sign on to the discharge petition and force a vote?
They very well might. You have to remember, the midterms are right around the corner. Primaries are starting pretty soon after the holidays. And if Republicans have any hope of maintaining their majorities or, in fact, extending their majorities, which is what the president is hoping they will do, they're going to have to do something about health care. This hits the populist base that they have all pledged to represent. And it's, at the moment, there's no sign of any help coming.
Well, I want to ask you as well about what the president had to say and what he wrote about Rob Reiner. A lot of Americans woke up this morning, Wendy, having not heard about his death. And it was apparently this is a murder case that involves Reiner and his wife. Their son has been taken into custody. The president wrote on Truth Social earlier today, a very sad thing happened last night in Hollywood. Rob Reiner, a tortured and struggling but once very talented movie director and comedy star, has passed away together with his wife. He goes on to say, reportedly due to the anger he caused others through his massive, unyielding, and incurable affliction with the mind-crippling disease known as Trump derangement syndrome, sometimes referred to as TDS. This is remarkable for a president coming off a weekend that saw 2 mass shootings, one at Brown University, of course, the other in Australia on what was the first day of Hanukkah. He doubled down on this when asked by reporters.
Yeah, this was stunning even to people who have become used to Trump's rather stunningly coarse discourse. As you know, I work on the weekends, and we watched Donald Trump at a reception have an opportunity to express sympathy for the shooting in Australia, as well as the one right here in the United States at Brown University. And he sort of whiffed on both, saying, well, we have a great relationship with Australia. This is too bad, saying nothing about the fact that it was an anti-Semitic terror attack. Then he said, something like, I'm sorry for the 2 who died at Brown University, but that was it. Then he sort of went on to entertain his guests. And then today, after the death of the celebrated director and his wife, apparently, well, at least the theory is, that their mentally ill son killed them, which is just a heartbreaking sort of thing. He put out that post. And the effect of this has been the latest in a series of bad moves that Trump has made that is pulling Republicans away from him. I mean, we had Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie, who you might expect both are retiring Republicans, and at this point, it might be expected that they can step out and say something critical of the president. They're not running for re-election. Sure. But then you had Jenna Ellis, who was one of Trump's lawyers in the election-denying case of 2020, saying this was horrible. Other conservative commentators are pointing out that Trump almost got Jimmy Kimmel fired, and they all talked about how awful the political commentary was around Charlie Kirk's death and decried it. And here is the leader of their party taking down a guy just because he's a Democrat. It was stunning.
Well, Wendy, we thank you for helping us frame that. Wendy Benjaminson with us in Washington. Indeed, Marjorie Taylor Greene on X, a family tragedy, not about politics or political enemies. Mike Lawler, the Republican from New York, this statement is wrong. Jenna Ellis, who Wendy mentioned, a man and his wife were murdered last night. This is not an appropriate response. Tom Massie, of course, not an ally of the president, but a Republican from Kentucky. Regardless of how you felt about Rob Reiner, this is inappropriate and disrespectful discourse about a man who was just brutally murdered. Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts, who we did not invite to only talk about this, but I need to get your take on this, Congressman, because a lot of members of Congress have raised their hands, and in many cases, Republicans, to check the president in what he said here. Does decorum no longer matter in the Oval Office?
Not to the president, no, but that's been clear for a decade now. This is the president's playbook. I mean, you know this. You've been covering him. To distract Americans from his corruption, his incompetence, he says and does outrageous, despicable things, and then there becomes this flurry of coverage about it, and it distracts from the core problem, which is he came into office saying he had a plan to keep Americans safe. He had a plan to lower prices, and he has totally failed on both. So expect that over the next 3 years, as he's increasingly divorced from reality and divorced from the mainstream American voter, that he's going to say and do ever more outrageous and despicable things. I'm not going to play this game where I hyperventilate every time he does it, because we've been doing it for a decade, and it's not serving the American middle class well. They know who he is. They know how bad of a person he is. And it's up to Democrats to demonstrate a compelling alternative.
Yeah, well, we're going to get to policy in a moment, because I don't want anyone hyperventilating either, Congressman. I just wonder, what have you heard, if anything, from your Republican colleagues away from the cameras and the microphones? Do they share the disappointment of the Greens, Lawlers, and Massies?
For 5 years, I've been hearing private condemnations of the president from congressional Republicans. It's background noise to me now, because the only thing I care about is a public divorce from him. That's the only way to have integrity in this town, is to be able to say publicly what you kvetch about privately, and they won't do it.
I guess that says a lot about where we are in Washington.
For Republicans, for sure. Now, they know that RFK is a quack and a conspiracist. They know that Howard Lutnick is corrupt and pitching tether. They know that Donald Trump is increasingly locked inside of a cocoon of crony capitalism, but they're not saying anything because they're afraid of their primaries. Well, Democrats, we are going to win these midterms, and we are going to demonstrate to the American public that we do have their best interests at heart. We are going to have an agenda to lower costs in housing and healthcare. We're going to have an agenda that is actually serious about American foreign policy, not parking aircraft carriers off the coast of Venezuela when nobody woke up asking for a land war in South America. We are going to take seriously public safety in our cities, not deploying ICE agents to pick up people in white vans. But it starts with us demonstrating a compelling alternative to this just incompetence and corruption that's awash in this town right now.
Well, I want to ask you about what is actually going to be taking place in the House of Representatives this week. There's going to be some votes specifically on health care, Congressman. We were just discussing this with Wendy. It's a little bit difficult to tell exactly what will be voted on, what will reach the floor, other than the Republican plan that Speaker Johnson put forth late Friday. There is a question as well about a Democratic plan by way of a discharge petition hitting the floor. Is that something that you see happening, or are we as good as over the cliff?
Well, let me start by saying that last week I introduced bipartisan drug pricing legislation that had as co-leads Rashida Tlaib, a member of the squad, and James Comer, one of the top Republicans seeking to impeach Joe Biden last term. So if I can get one of the most progressive and one of the most conservative Republicans in Congress on complicated drug pricing policy, then certainly we can tackle the Affordable Care Act, we can tackle health savings accounts, we can address the structural drivers of high prices in U.S. health care piece by piece. But it requires coalition building and it requires deep policy work, not performance. And what Speaker Johnson is doing this week is performance. He is offering this health care vote as a way to try to provide some top cover for his members, but none of these bills address the near-end threat to Americans, which is their Affordable Care Act premiums are about to spike.
Spoke earlier today with your colleague from Montana, Troy Downing, a Republican, who explained to us what I just referred to, Congressman. He says it's too late already, that the horse is out of the barn. Here's how he put it.
A lot of the rhetoric that we see on social media from headlines from people pushing back is we have to do something or premiums are going up. Premiums already went up. The open enrollment period is over. Yeah. I mean, that's already baked in. This whole argument about if we don't do something by the 31st, then suddenly premiums are going to go up. Well, I'm going to tell you, if the enhanced premium tax credits, if the Obamacare tax credits expire, rates have gone up. If they get extended, rates have gone up. It's the same thing no matter what.
That would suggest that this scenario is unfixable, Congressman. Do you disagree?
What a compelling Republican message on health care. Hey, you don't like high prices? Well, too bad. They're here to stay. No, that's totally unacceptable. One, you can extend the open enrollment period and apply the enhanced premium tax credits to a longer open enrollment period. But more fundamentally, American health premiums are going up 10 to 15% year over year. It is suffocating the middle class. And Congress cannot simply throw up our hands and say, well, we tried, but we didn't have any success. No, we need to do serious reforms on the drug pricing supply chain. We need to demand transparency and more competition in hospital pricing. We need to empower patients and primary care physicians rather than insurance companies. There's a whole host of reforms, all of which can be bipartisan if we roll up our sleeves and get there. And again, I've done it on pharmacy benefit manager reform, but it requires good faith negotiating partners, not simply this defeatism being broadcast from Montana.
So just to extend that a little bit then, obviously the Senate's leaving town this week, so even if something succeeds in the House, it would likely have to be addressed following the 5th of January, right, once everybody comes back from that break. Could legislation be written that retroactively covers people back to the end of this year and also extends the enrollment period, the point that you just made, giving people more opportunity to realize what their new rates would be under the legislation and stay on their health care plan? Is that something that would require some sort of Christmas miracle?
Well, I don't know what you mean by retroactively cover people, because, I mean, obviously insurance is a prospective good, but you can certainly extend the open enrollment period, and you can, I mean, we're Congress, like we write the laws. We can write laws around the Affordable Care Act that does anything that we want it to do, but the most important thing that we want it to do is to extend the premium tax credits to give the middle class breathing room for a year. It is not saying that we shouldn't do reforms to the ACA. It's not saying that we're not open to other concepts, whether it's health savings accounts or association health plans that Republicans have been put forward, but they have to be enveloped within a broader baseline of everybody needs access to health insurance in this country. Because when that catastrophic event happens, whether it's cancer, whether it's a child born with a rare condition, now it's too late to get that insurance. And so it's a key commitment from Democrats to Americans that everyone needs that coverage up front so that you have the financial security that everyone deserves.
Well, when we talk about going over the cliff, how worried are you about people dropping off the rolls altogether, Congressman, as opposed to simply accepting those higher premiums until something could be done?
It's already happening. And that does two things. One, it takes a pool of people, and now they don't have health insurance. And as I said, that exposes them to catastrophic medical events that leads to bankruptcy. And health events are the #1 driver of of bankruptcy in this country. Number two, it weakens the Affordable Care Act exchanges because it can create a spiral whereby there's adverse selection on those exchanges, meaning that the population that remains is sicker and sicker and sicker, which means their premiums go up and up and up. And so what we really need is to spin that flywheel in the other direction, where we are getting more and more people onto the Affordable Care Act exchanges. And again, there are good bipartisan ideas for how to do this. The individual contribution health retirement health reimbursement arrangements, for example, ICRAs, are a reasonable approach for doing that. I am happy to work on that with Republicans, but their proposal can't simply be, hey, we're going to take away the ACA and then trust that everybody will have enough money to have a health savings account and go buy health care when they need it. No, that's not insurance. That's not protection for people in their worst moments.
Well, this is going to be an interesting week in your chamber. Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts. Congressman, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. Now to the ongoing manhunt in Providence, Rhode Island, that we've barely had a chance to refer to after the Brown University attack that left 2 killed and 9 others injured over the weekend. The town's mayor giving this update overnight.
Shortly, we will be releasing the person of interest who had been detained earlier today. And the Attorney General can speak a little bit about the rationale for that. But we want to inform the community that that individual will shortly be released from Providence Police.
And there is another briefing that's, in fact, underway right now in the city of Providence as authorities update matters. Let's go to World Headquarters in New York for the latest now from Bloomberg's Myles Miller. He's our senior national security reporter who's been, unfortunately, very busy over the past couple of days here. Myles, it was a striking moment when we saw once again the FBI provide a name that had to be taken back as a person of interest. Even the President of the United States had said on social media that someone was in custody. He was quick to throw, it appears, Providence police or campus police under the bus. Did the FBI play any role in this?
Yeah, the FBI was very crucial in providing the bodies needed to get this done, to figure out who this suspect is. And we'll get to the president's remarks in just a moment. But of course, as you said, officials in Providence and law enforcement are addressing reporters as we speak. Their search for the suspect who killed those 2 students on Saturday continues. They've enhanced their police presence there at Brown because this person is not in custody. What they've done is release grainy surveillance video depicting the suspect clad in all black walking down the street near campus. Now, police haven't recovered the gun used in this incident, and so law enforcement believes that person is still armed and dangerous. That person of interest who they detained on Sunday, whose name was out there because of leaks, has been released and cleared in the investigation. And the FBI telling Bloomberg tonight there was never a suspect identified, only a person of interest, and that people were spreading a bad narrative there. And if you go back and read the director's tweet, everything he said was factual. Well, the president echoing that, pointing the finger at Brown University, saying that their failure to quickly identify a suspect, and saying that the Bureau came in after the fact and that the FBI will do a good job. We'll see what happens with that.
Another story today. Apparently, the FBI has been rather busy here, Myles, as the Attorney General says federal agents were able to stop a planned New Year's Eve bombing campaign in Southern California. What do we know about this?
Yeah, so this was 4 people who were involved in this incident, and what they were planning to do was set off improvised explosive devices at various places in Southern California. They were able to get onto this because there were sources who tipped them off to some of this investigation. And what did they find? They went up in a surveillance plane, and when they got in that plane, they saw them, as you see in that video, setting up these improvised explosive devices in the desert, trying to detonate them. These would have been remotely controlled improvised explosive devices set to go off at the strike of midnight on New Year's Eve. This was a group of folks who call themselves anti-government. They were pro-Palestinian activists. And what we know from the government is that this is exactly the type of extremism that the president says he wants to get rid of in this country. They have their day in court later today.
A lot to talk about with Myles this evening. Bloomberg's Myles Miller, thank you so much for the great reporting. Coming up, President Trump is weighing his choice to lead the Fed, and we'll break down the latest details on the search. Coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us. Wall Street is gearing up for a flurry of key economic data that will help shape the Fed's 2026 outlook. With stocks wavering today, for details, we turn to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from World Headquarters in New York. This is going to be a doozy, Romaine.
Yeah, and it's kind of like the setup this week is similar to what we had at the start of last week, Joe, where stocks were basically in a holding pattern, and for that matter, bonds as well, awaiting the big Fed decision last Wednesday. This time, it's a Jobs Tuesday that they're keeping an eye on here. And I'm just going to quote the head of fixed income for DWS Americas. He said, quote, "The single most important data point for next year is tomorrow's employment figures that come out. Employment figures that will largely include full releases for the month of November, a partial collection of data for the month of October. But the idea here that this is really going to shape the idea of where the labor market stands for a Fed that has become much more laser focused on the health of that labor market in determining whether they should cut rate next. Of course, the backdrop of all this are a lot of members on this committee right now who kind of feel that the Fed has actually been behind the curve. Stephen Myron, just a little bit earlier today, was an event in New York, Joe, and he talked about this idea that in his view, the inflation picture, that's benign. He thinks there's way too much focus on it, saying that he thinks that we'll see a more normalization of inflation when it comes to the rent side of the equation, as well as more of a normalization when it comes to the services side of the equation. The market's not quite buying that just yet, Joe. That's why you're not seeing a whole lot of activity in the pricing today, but that could change in a big way at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow when we start to get those data, when we start to get those numbers released.
Yeah, we're going to have a lot to talk about by this time tomorrow. Romaine Bostick, thank you so much. This conversation around the Fed comes as the president continues to mull over his choice as to who should be the next Fed chair. The Kevins, he said, Warsh or Hassett. With us now with more details on the search, Bloomberg's Christopher Condon. I guess more than a search, they're done with interviews at this point, right? What should the market be noticing about these two gentlemen that's different, if not just Hassett's closeness to the president?
Well, yeah, we can start with Hassett. A longtime Trump loyalist and expected to push a very dovish agenda. He's been with the president for quite a long time. He was CEA chair in the first administration, stuck with him in the intervening years. And he really hasn't, I don't recall him putting forth a major policy proposition that is out of line with the president's wishes. And so that causes some hesitancy in financial markets, for sure, where they want to see, if not hawkishness, at least a vigilance as regards inflation. Kevin Hassett is a curious second possible choice. He has always been hawkish. When he was a Fed governor, appointed by George W. Bush, he was always for higher interest rates than many of his colleagues, much more vigilant.
He's been talking a little bit differently these days.
Very different. He's made a curious switch now. But of course, the president has said he's not going to pick somebody who doesn't want to cut interest rates.
Christopher Condon knows this better than anyone else. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. U.S. and Ukrainian negotiators emerging upbeat from peace talks in Berlin that tackled some of the most difficult issues on ending Russia's war against Ukraine. The U.S. delegation describing the talks as positive said that consensus had been reached on an estimated 90% of outstanding issues. That, of course, leaves the hard stuff. President Trump commenting on the progress of the peace talks earlier today.
I think we're closer now, and they will tell you that they're closer now. We had numerous conversations with President Putin of Russia, and I think we're closer now than we have been ever.
Joining us now with her insights, Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine in the Obama administration. It's great to see you, Evelyn. Pretty remarkable to see President Zelensky agree to another concession, in this case backing off his demand that Ukraine join NATO at some point in the years ahead. But we are still talking about security guarantees that could give Ukraine something to count on when it comes to protection by the U.S. and our European allies. Are we closer to a peace deal here or not?
I mean, Joe, it does feel like we're closer because we see the Ukrainians making, as you pointed out, increasing number of concessions. And, you know, taking the NATO membership off the table is a huge security guarantee option that they now no longer have, which is why, of course, they're looking for an Article 5 type guarantee from the United States, a bilateral guarantee, since they can't get the multilateral one. But I'm afraid we don't know what the Russian side is saying or planning. And there I'm a little more skeptical. Even if they agree to continue the talks or to a ceasefire, the Russians seem adamant at keeping or actually getting control of territory that they don't even have troops on. They're still talking their maximalist goals, Joe.
Has Russia made a single concession in these talks since they have begun?
No, not a single one. And, you know, I'm reading some of the reporting, and it sounds like there may be additional concessions that are being discussed, like sharing, you know, Russia and Ukraine sharing control over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. I mean, these are huge things that Ukraine is discussing and potentially forfeiting. And they were, let's not forget, they were the victims here. Russia engaged in an aggressive human rights bashing, you know, war of rape and torture and kidnapping of children and bombing of civilian, you know, infrastructure and buildings and people, which is still ongoing. And they're getting rewarded, it looks like, Joe. So, you know, I'm a little bit nervous here, although I am glad that these talks seem very serious.
Well, that is true. And I guess I wonder where you think Zelensky's own psyche is at this point. He's speaking more like he wants a deal. He's also looking at a peace plan that many thought would be a non-starter for him when it comes to giving up territory, for instance, when you take NATO off the table here, when you consider his offer of holding presidential elections. He's moving himself here, isn't he? How badly does Zelensky want to have a deal?
Well, Joe, we know that Zelensky wants this war to end incredibly badly. Probably he wants to see his family. Probably he wants to get a good night's sleep. I'm sure that, you know, he wants the killing to end. He wants this war to end. He didn't even, you know, he didn't plan for this war. He was actually sworn in as a president in 2019 that would fight corruption and bring the war to an end. And all the Russians did was escalate and make the war even more brutal and painful for civilians mostly. So, you know, he definitely wants the war to end. And this is a test. He's testing, frankly, the United States. He's testing our president. You know, can you make a fair peace for me or not? If it's not a fair peace, then that tells you that it's not going to be likely a lasting peace, because Russia needs to be prevented through security guarantees and, you know, from holding on to any of Ukraine, holding control of Ukraine's sovereignty. The other part of it, Joe, is that if Russia is rewarded and there's no price to be paid for these human rights violations, it will only embolden other countries to use the same brutal means that Russia has used. And that, of course, puts all of us in danger.
I want to ask you about this concept of replacing a NATO membership with a sort of equivalent Article 5 agreement with the U.S. or with other allies, presumably as part of a security guarantee. I talked to Heather Conley about this, a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise, on the early edition of Balance of Power. Here's what she had to say.
the U.S. would have to have those security guarantees. There's some rumors coming out of Berlin that the administration would submit these security guarantees for Senate ratification, almost like a treaty, like we would do to amend the NATO treaty. That would be important. But yes, Europe has to be part of this as well. And the Ukrainians have negotiated bilateral security guarantees with those countries. But the question, Joe, is when they're tested, will we apply military power against Russian forces, again, when they violate this peace deal?
Is this a viable offer for Ukraine, Evelyn?
So I agree with what Heather is saying there. The reality is President Trump is probably the only, president in recent history who can get a treaty through the U.S. Congress, this particular Senate, which, it requires 2/3 ratification. And if it's done as a treaty, then it is binding on the United States to defend Ukraine, unlike the Budapest Memorandum, which was a political document. It wasn't binding. And so when the Russians invaded in 2014, we just provided assistance from the sidelines. This agreement would mean we'd have to fight Russia. The problem with it is that I'm not sure whether this executive branch would take action. And Congress alone cannot force the government to make good by its word, make good by the treaty. So I'm a little bit concerned also because President Trump apparently said this is a limited time offer, as if it's like a consumer good or something. If we're really serious about peace in Ukraine, it should not be a limited time offer. And, we should be willing to stick by it. It's a very serious offer.
Well, with all of that said, one thing that's not been reported on very much, Evelyn, in the NDAA that is making its way through Congress right now. It passed the House. It's going to the Senate this week. This is the must pass, as it's referred to, National Defense Authorization. It has $400 million for support for Ukraine. This is something that actually surprised me, and it's interesting that we're not hearing any Republican members of the House talk about it who are concerned about continuing this investment and what they see as another forever war, in this case with Russia. Do you know what that money would go to, if this is intelligence sharing, other logistics, or actual military hardware?
I confess I haven't looked at the National Defense Authorization Act, although I was a staffer for almost a decade on that committee. So I should have looked at it. I will tell you, though, that it is significant for political reasons, as you said. It demonstrates bipartisan support for Ukraine. That has not changed. Yes, there may be one or two, senators and one or two House members, a small faction of House members, who are opposed to providing assistance directly to Ukraine. But this is significant. And since it's the Armed Services Committee, I imagine it's to buy weapons for Ukraine through the Europeans. So this is significant because, again, this time not through the Europeans, we would be paying for it. So that is significant.
It's good to have you back, Evelyn, as always. Executive Director of the McCain Institute, we thank you for being with us. Evelyn Farkas on Bloomberg TV and radio. We'll continue our conversation with the big stories gripping Washington here when our political panel convenes up ahead. First, some of the stories that we are watching in today's Power Brief. First, leadership at consulting giant McKinsey discussing cutting about 10% of jobs internally across non-client-facing departments, which could amount to thousands of layoffs the next 2 years. Exclusive reporting by Bloomberg detailing how the firm's revenue growth has effectively flatlined in the past 5 years, leading to a reset after rapid hiring over the prior decade. This comes after the company's push to eliminate about 1,400 jobs in 2023 under the internal codename Project Magnolia. McKinsey does still plan to hire more consultants as cuts are made to support functions, according to people familiar with the matter. Ford Motor Company says it'll take $19.5 billion in charges tied to a sweeping overhaul of its electric vehicle business after struggling for years to make it profitable. The majority of the charges will come in the fourth quarter, Ford said Monday in a statement. As part of the strategic shift, the automaker is canceling a planned electric F-Series truck, shifting production toward gas and hybrid vehicles, and repurposing an EV battery plant. Ford CEO Jim Farley telling our own Romaine Bostick in a Bloomberg interview, quote, "It didn't make sense to keep plowing billions into products that we knew would not make money. We had to make this choice," unquote. Speaking as well today with Bloomberg's Matt Miller. And far-right candidate Jose Antonio Cast won the Chilean presidency in a landslide victory last evening, sweeping all 16 regions of Chile and driving the country to its most dramatic shift to the right in decades. Cast will take office March 11th and is vowing to crack down on immigration, crime, taxes, and government spending, saying in his acceptance speech, Chile will again be free of crime, free of anguish, free of fear. Coming up, a live report from Australia following this weekend's deadly terror attack that left 16 people dead after gunmen opened fire on a Hanukkah celebration at the iconic Bondi Beach. That update next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
What we saw yesterday was an act of pure evil, an act of anti-Semitism, an act of terrorism on our shores in an iconic Australian location, Bondi Beach, that is associated with joy, associated with families gathering, associated with celebrations, and it is forever tarnished by what has occurred last evening.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. That was Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese condemning the deadly Bondi Beach Hanukkah terror attack over the weekend that left at least 15 people and the gunman dead. The attack marks Australia's worst terror attack, and Albanese described the incident, as you just heard, as an act of evil, anti-Semitism. Joining us now with the latest developments here from the ground in Sydney itself is Bloomberg's Paul Allen. Paul, what are the next stages of this investigation?
Well, the investigation's still ongoing, and we are getting details. The latest details are the police are now investigating a trip to the Philippines that were made by this father and son duo. You mentioned the father, Sajid Akram, shot dead by police. The other gunman was his son, 24-year-old Nazim Akram. He's in critical condition in hospital, but is expected to survive to face charges. But police now probing this trip that the pair took to the Philippines last year. And the Philippines, the southern area of which is known to be the home of Islamic State in East Asia, that group very active there. And an Islamic State flag was also found in the car that the pair took to the scene. Now at the scene, meanwhile, mourners continue to gather. There is a large and growing floral tribute there as well. It's a very, very busy area down there, particularly at this time of year. We're coming into summer in Australia, of course, but there is an eerie and mournful silence at Bondi Beach at the moment. People are gathering, but nobody is talking. They're just there to lay flowers and pay their respects. But eventually this sense of shock is giving way, well, we're seeing it already, giving way to questions of how this could happen.
Yeah. Paul, Albanese was quick to suggest a review of gun laws in Australia. What will be the government or legislative answer to this?
Yeah, there's a popular misconception, particularly in the US, that it's illegal to own a gun in Australia. That's not correct. You can legally own a gun in Australia. And Sajid Akram, the deceased gunman, legally owned 6 guns. He was a member of a gun club. He held a license, so he was following all the rules. Police have recovered all 6 weapons. So in terms of tightening the laws, Anthony Albanese says perhaps there should be a limit on the number of firearms any individual should own, and perhaps also a review of an individual's gun license every few years, because people's circumstances change. And in respect of that, his son, 24-year-old Nazim Akram, was investigated by ASIO, the spy agency, back in 2019 for alleged links to Islamic State. And that investigation was precipitated by 2 of his associates being jailed for links also. So you'd like to think that had police known that and had stricter gun laws been in place, perhaps Sajid Akram would not have had access to those weapons. But the idea of tightening gun laws, very widely supported. State and federal leaders are ready to act on that very, very quickly.
Really interesting. Paul, thank you. Bloomberg's Paul Allen reporting live from Sydney. Joining us now with their reaction to all the events of the weekend into this day, this evening's political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital, and Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. It's great to see you both, and I'd love to just go to the 3,000-foot level with the two of you, if I could here, because a lot of Americans woke up this morning having been involved in their lives or taking care of holiday stuff over the weekend, woke up to a lot of these headlines, or certainly read more deeply into them. And we add, of course, the manhunt in Providence, Rhode Island, the shooting that we saw at Brown University, 2 dead. And then, of course, the murder of Rob Reiner and his wife. Rick Davis, this is a time where the American electorate can feel great exhaustion going through a series of shocking stories like these, and maybe they hit home for some folks, and it usually calls on a leader to try to deliver some words, to try to direct people through this time. It's the first day of Hanukkah, my God. And the President of the United States decided to double down on his derision of the Reiner family. If not the President, who?
Yeah, the level of tone deafness from President Trump's comments related to the Reiner murders kind of betrays where the country is. I mean, we just went through a very tumultuous year, fighting in Ukraine, fighting in Israel, anti-Semitism at home, the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Those were all things that could bring a country together, right? Overcoming adversity is a unique and I think really powerful characteristic of the American people. And but we don't have a president that sort of, I think, embraces that. It was very loud, his sorrow over the assassination of Charlie Kirk and the demand that everybody respect that. But that's got to go for everybody. And if it does, then it's a powerful tool that the president uses it as bully pulpit to bring the country together. But today we didn't see that.
Yeah. I don't know what the fallout is here, politically speaking, Jeannie, but emotionally speaking, a lot of people are not only exhausted, but they feel insecure when you go through a number of events like this in a short period of time. You add the layer of the holidays. What was the president thinking when he posted that?
Yeah, I mean, it is utterly disgraceful. And you juxtapose the president's statement after the horrific murders of Rob Reiner and his wife at the hands of their son, who apparently has some issues with mental health and addiction. And you juxtapose that with what Rob Reiner himself said on Piers Morgan right after the horrific assassination of Charlie Kirk, in which Rob Reiner showed Donald Trump and everybody else how you respond to the horrific assassination and killing of somebody you may happen to disagree with politically. He did it in a dignified manner, and that is completely missing from the president. That's not a surprise anymore to us. What is a surprise to a certain extent for me is that very few Republicans have come out and really spoken out against what the president said. We've had the usual suspects, Tom Massey, Marjorie Taylor Greene, but most Republican leaders have been silent. And that is what is so frustrating, as have other people in the White House. And so here we sit with a president who would say something that disgraceful about somebody who has been assassinated, killed, murdered by his own child and his wife.
He said it was reportedly due, the murder, this was this morning, by the way, before the Reiner's son was taken into custody, reportedly due to the anger he caused others through his massive, unyielding, and incurable affliction with a mind-crippling disease known as Trump derangement syndrome. He was asked about that post in the Oval Office when reporters joined him a short time ago. Let's listen.
I wasn't a fan of his at all. He was a deranged person as far as Trump is concerned. He said he knew it was false. In fact, it's the exact opposite, that I was a friend of Russia, controlled by Russia. You know, it was the Russia hoax. He was one of the people behind it. I think he hurt himself in career-wise. He became like a deranged person, Trump derangement syndrome. So I was not a fan of Rob Reiner at all in any way, shape, or form. I thought he was very bad for our country.
Doubling down in the Oval Office. Rick, to Jeannie's point, we heard from Marjorie Taylor Greene, called the murders a family tragedy, not about politics or political enemies. Mike Lawler, Republican from New York, the statement is wrong. Even former Trump lawyer Jenna Ellis raising some eyebrows. A man and his wife were murdered last night. This is not the appropriate response. I'm not sure there are any others to follow here. Do you expect, as Jeannie said, that Republican leadership weighs in, or do they know how short Americans' collective memory is, and tomorrow the news cycle will bring us to something else?
I don't think it's so much about the short memory of the American electorate. I think it has a lot to do with trying to find a way through this administration without yourself getting into the barrel. You know, they used to have a saying in politics that, you know, it's your time in the barrel. Yeah. And I know that there are a lot of members of Congress who spend a decent amount of time figuring out how to avoid the barrel as it relates to President Trump. And this is a good example that it really is about Donald Trump to Donald Trump. And when you start talking about yourself in the third person, that's never a good thing. Yeah. So yeah, it's an unfortunate thing. It's not what I think we expect out of our leadership. And yet I do think voters remember that. And there's a reason why in the first 10, 11 months of this administration, Donald Trump's approval ratings have substantially decreased, because it's the cumulative effect of days like today. And I think that I was talking to a well-known Republican consultant today about this, and he said that at this rate, Donald Trump's approval rating will be in the teens by the time his administration's over. I mean, like, that is what happens to you if you are using opportunities like this to divide instead of unify.
Is that how you see it, Jeannie? Because a lot of folks think Donald Trump can say anything he wants and get reelected, but of course he's not going to be on the ballot in the midterms.
He's not. And even over the weekend, he said his party could lose the House in the midterms. I do think he may continue to go down, and likely will. And the problem for the president is he has never been particularly popular from a personal perspective. He's, you know, maintained about his 30, 32%, 33%. The problem for him is that he is now losing support when it comes to two things that he was actually people were following him on, which was the economy and immigration. And that for him is a real problem. And I think that's also got people on edge as he continues to drop support on the economy and immigration. What is he going to do next to try to revive his presidency less than a year in? We've got Friday the Epstein files coming out. We've got people who are saying, are we looking at a wag the dog scenario with this president? It is very, very concerning for people, as you called it, Joe, at an uncertain time in the country, what the president is going to do next, as he knows firsthand, looking at the polls, he is losing support amongst his own base on issues that they care about.
You talk about being on the barrel, Rick. At what point, when you look at the calendar between now and next November, do Republican members, specifically in the House, start putting their own fortunes ahead of their relationship with Donald Trump?
Well, I think you see that now.
Yeah,
I think there's a real trend going. The numbers in the last few elections, especially in the first Tuesday in November, have been very stark to Republicans who are up for re-election this cycle, both governors, senators, and congressmen, that they cannot rely upon the voters who came out for Donald Trump to come out for them. And so that fear is, I think, starting to seep its way into their campaigns, where they're starting to find a set of issues. And that is one of the reasons why they're very concerned about this health care debate, because right now that is one of the issues that are facing them right away.
With 5 legislative days to go, more like 4 at this point. We'll be in touch with our great panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, as we head for the deadline on Obamacare subsidies expiring. Read more about that in the Washington Edition newsletter, on the terminal and online. And we'll meet you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.